Hello, this is Steve Davis from Javelin Wealth Management. We're here for one of our 20 Conversations series. In past episodes of this Talk Fest, we've had talking to me about a hike that I did 18 months ago across Spain. We've had people talking about glamping. We've had people talking about the role of business and business development. So today we're going to be talking about media, and we're very privileged and lucky to have with us Sudhir Vadaketh from Jom Media, which is his company. But he's had quite an eclectic history. He's worked for very large media organizations like The Economist, and he's also a graduate of the very prestigious Kennedy School at Harvard, on which he presumably did something that was media orientated. So he and I are going to have a conversation today to talk about media and its role, not only in promoting opinion and news, but in the way that it's shaped and has been developed as a result of new technological innovations, not least of which is the role of internet, social media, and now increasingly artificial intelligence. So, Sudhir, thank you for coming to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us about your t-shirt first.
My t-shirt has become sort of my official Jom uniform. Save the friendly unicorn, or the more commonly, shut the fuck up. Yeah. And it's just one of those phrases that I like, partly because you can use it in different contexts. You can use it in an aggressive way, like SDFU, or you can use it in a fun way, like you actually climbed that mountain, like SDFU. So it's got a variety of emotional purposes. That's partly why I like this particular phrase.
I think I need to get one of those.
Yeah.
But thank you.
I'll
anyway,
sort you out.
Good. So tell us a little bit about you. So I gave an introduction that you'd been working for The Economist, you'd been to the Kennedy School and so forth. So tell us a little bit about your life up to this point and why you've gone out and set up your own independent media company.
Yeah, so I grew up in Singapore, went to college in the States. I think if we rewind from the Kennedy School, I did my undergrad at Berkeley, and that was really a seminal experience for me, having gone through the Singapore educational system and then going to a liberal arts school in America. That kind of opened my eyes to a lot of different things, in terms of social justice, in terms of how I could have an impact in the world and things like that. And yeah, then I went to the Kennedy School, and then I came back to Singapore and joined the Economist Group. I worked for a unit called the Economist Corporate Network, which is sort of a sister unit of the magazine. I contributed to the magazine occasionally, but that sort of 7-year period, I think, was really important for me. This was 2006 to 2013, and if you think back to that time in the world, there were a couple of things going on. One was there was a huge shift of geopolitical, economic attention from the West to Asia, the rise of China, then later on the rise of India, and just being at an organization like that, being able to observe this shift through the businesses we came into contact with, through the analysts I came into contact with, I think that was really educational for me in so many ways. The other reason it was great to be there at a big legacy media company at that point in time was because of the whole shift from print to digital. So I kind of had a ringside seat to all that sort of digital disruption that we now know today completely upended the legacy media world. But at that point in time, it just gave me such a great insight into how modes of consumption were changing, how internal processes and teams had to change with the shift from print to digital. You no longer had the limits of a page for your piece. You could write in different ways. There was a shift towards video and other forms of short form content. So just being at a publication like that, when they were moving from the same paper that we've been using for a couple of 100 years to things like apps and content on smartphones, I think was just really educational and informational for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And The Economist, probably to this day, is still one of the few publications that still has a reputation for being, if you will, balanced and objective, whereas a lot of other publications have kind of taken a side. How easy do you think it is to still maintain that sort of level of moderation within a media context? Do you think that the demands of society now require media outlets to come up with something that's talking to a particular interest group and that's where they get paid, or is it still trying to promote and in the interest of promoting that balanced view and allowing people to make up their own minds?
So there's quite a lot to unpack there. I think the first thing I'd say is, balance and objective are heavily debated terms in the media today for good reason. And in terms of The Economist, I think every publication has its ideological biases. With The Economist, one would argue when it comes to economic issues, they are probably slightly right of center, pro-free trade, for example. When it comes to social issues, they're probably on the left. So that's the ideological bias of The Economist. What's great about the publication is that they're very transparent about their biases, so you know where they're coming from, which is not, you couldn't say the same for a lot of new publications out there. And I'm not even talking about fronts for propaganda. I'm just talking about traditional publications not being totally upfront about their own internal biases when it comes to covering content. In terms of whether the modern media environment incentivizes commentators towards a more opinionated or more sensationalized perspective, which is sort of my reading of the second half of your question.
Yeah.
I think you have those incentives now for a whole bunch of reasons, including the fact that new business models sort of incentivize speed, engagement, shares, everything associated with our modern sort of fast-paced social media-fueled media world. And because of that, you could argue that there is a tendency for more sensational, quote-unquote, opinionated commentary to sort of take precedence over perhaps arguably drier type commentary, which is what you might find in The Economist and other traditional publications.
So do you think that in the modern environment, therefore, that speed is coming at the expense of depth and analysis?
I think you could make a strong argument for that. I do think we're going through sort of a transitory period. I think / hope, as somebody who enjoys long form content, I hope we're going through a transitory period where the demands of short form content, the fact that we have shorter attention spans, I hope it's sort of a hump that we get over and eventually return to the glorious days of reading books and long form articles. But I think equally you can also make an argument that there's actually a secular shift going on right now, and there's a whole new generation that is not going to be as attracted to longer form content as maybe boomers like you and me.
Yeah.
Sorry to put us in the same category.
I'm a bit older than you, so I'm not sure you want to be in the same category as me, but let's talk a little bit about that secular shift. So it's 2024, so we're talking in September of 2024. Obviously there have been a whole load of elections during the course of this year, and we've got one very big one coming up in the United States at the beginning of November. Media and the way that information is being disseminated at the moment is faster than ever before. You get social media jumping in with its opinions very, very quickly as to whether or not somebody won or otherwise in a debate or something of that sort of nature. But is that the sort of secular shift that you're referring to, or is it just in terms of the way that people are now choosing to consume media and where they get it from?
No, I think the secular shift I was talking about was mostly about the sorts of content that we enjoy consuming in terms of length, in terms of format, whether it's short form video versus reading, whether it's podcast versus reading. I think that there's a whole bunch of things going on there. In terms of the shift towards media commentators of the quote-unquote new age, I think that's something very different that's going on. So you have your traditional legacy publications, and some have actually been doing quite well, like the New York Times, through the digital disruption. But you also have a whole bunch of smaller players now that are actually gaining more and more market share and eyeballs, and I think that's, a publication like Jom also hopes to enter that independent media space. And I think the internet and digital disruption has been good for smaller publications in that sense. To what extent people shift their media consumption from just legacy media towards also following smaller niche publications, I think that's happening for a whole bunch of reasons. So you think about everything from YouTube commentators to Substack, individual Substack channels. And I think the general thesis right now, you know, the past year has been a year of sort of decimation for a lot of media companies all over the world. But I think the general thesis right now is that you're going to have this sort of like your big sort of mass market publications at the top, your New York Times, your Economists of the world. But you're also going to have space for a whole bunch of smaller, very niche players as well, which are actually tailoring and customizing their content for very specific interest groups. In the case of Jom, it's our specificity is sort of long-form analytical content just for Singapore and eventually Southeast Asia. So that's the niche we're targeting. You know, that there's no way we're ever going to be able to compete in that sort of mass market segment that the likes of the New York Times are competing in.
Yeah.
The problem for the big players is that at some point they're going to get commoditized, because whereas 20 or 30 years ago you had the New York Times specializing in news around the New York area, you had publications like the LA Times perhaps specializing in news in Southern California.
Yeah.
And now all that has kind of been commoditized in a way for the very, very big players who essentially have correspondents and units and offices all over the world. And that's happened as well with the old business model being completely broken down as well, which was a very advertising dependent business model. And that's been broken by the likes of Google and Facebook and Amazon, which have drawn a lot of the advertising dollars away. So in this new, almost reader funded model that we have today, it's actually a very different landscape for the big players at the top. So the current thesis, is probably that you'll have big players there surviving, you know, intensely competing with each other, but you'll also have space for niche, very niche players at the bottom, Substackers and YouTubers and things like that.
So that's an interesting point. So we've seen, from your perspective, a change in the way that the media landscape works, from the provision of local news. So the local newspaper, the one that I used to grow up with in North London, just focused on Hampstead and Highgate, which are two small areas in the North London. But it was advertiser funded, and they would advertise local events, local service providers, local companies that are providing services to local residents. Now all of that, obviously, you can get by a quick Google search and don't even need it. It seems to me that what you're getting in terms of the media markets is that you've replaced that sort of locally focused news and everything else by interest focused news and everything else. So people are sort of saying, well, I'm not really so interested in what my neighbour's up to, but I'm much more interested in what my interest groups are up to, whether or not that's sports, politics, whatever else it might be, so that you're choosing a different definition of community. Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, absolutely. I think one of the really liberating things about the internet is its ability to allow you to find these common interest groups all over the world, whatever your little unique hobby or interest might be. The flip side of that, in my opinion, is that there's been this delinking between geography and information. So whereas in the old days with the local newspapers, people in a particular geography would live life with a more or less common set base of information and facts. Today what you're finding is that people in the same geography might actually just be listening and hearing very, very different bits of information and news depending on their particular interests and depending on the little sort of filter bubble that they've created for themselves based on their particular viewing habits, and that's how algorithms work.
Yes.
And so this delinking of geography and information, I think, is a liberating thing in many aspects for people who couldn't find community near them, but it's also problematic in many circumstances if you think about how people just simply operate on a shared base of facts and information with the person next to them.
Hence the echo chamber type concept.
Yeah. So, you know, echo chambers, which are one of the probably most pernicious things about social media and the way we think about and absorb and think about information today, I think they are probably one of the main reasons for group polarization in society and just general political polarization in society. And I think sort of moving on from that, social media, the way social media interacts with the reality of life and whether it accentuates polarization or just reflects polarization, I think is a very interesting conversation. And I think echo chambers and the way echo chambers work and the way, often when somebody breaks an echo chamber, it's a viewpoint from the other side, and it can be much more vociferous, much more antagonistic than any comment you would get in real life, right? There's a performative aspect of social media which actually accentuates the sorts of commentary that you get versus if we were just talking like this face to face, and all that sort of accentuates polarization actually, in my view. Sorry, I sort of digressed a bit from the original point.
No, but I mean that also then brings us on to this whole point about trust and regulation. So both your business, German Media, John, and my business, Javelin Wealth Management, we rely on trust. And trust is hard to win, it's hard to retain, and it's very easy to lose. The same applies obviously with media and with reputations that are created by media, which has resulted in a much greater degree of call for regulation to control the way in which media works, the stories that are put out, particularly if they are controversial or potentially quite negative. How do you see that developing? And obviously the second part of that question is who's going to be doing the regulation? Because obviously governments normally would fulfill that role. But then again, governments have their own trust issues. So how do you see that working over the course of the next years?
So I think in dealing with disinformation, I'll focus on disinformation first. And if you think about orchestrated campaigns, you spoke about this being an important election year. There have been several orchestrated campaigns. In January this year, Taiwan had its presidential election, and I think people refer to the disinformation that was happening from China to Taiwan as actually the first instance of a state using AI-generated disinformation to try to affect an election. And we've seen a bunch of other examples as well this year of sort of state-sanctioned disinformation campaigns. And I think experts around the world, I think the World Economic Forum sort of released a report where almost 1,500 experts ranked misinformation and disinformation as sort of the greatest global risk, above war and famine and things like that. So it's an extremely real problem, and there are different ways to sort of tackle it. I think regulation is something that different governments, depending on how autocratic or liberal they are, sort of embrace different forms, right? Singapore has an online falsehoods law called POFMA that's meant to deal with misinformation and disinformation. On the one side of the spectrum, you might argue is a place like China that has extremely repressive autocratic laws when it comes to and ways of dealing with what it considers to be falsehoods or things that it doesn't want its population to actually listen or hear, which spans everything from things like Tiananmen and all sorts of things that China cracks down on. And then you have other countries that obviously have a much more open and liberal way of dealing with it, like the US. In terms of a broad societal approach to dealing with disinformation and misinformation, I think the only way it's going to work is if tech companies, civil society organizations, academics, and the government actually work together to come up with solutions. And people often refer to Taiwan as one of the gold standards for this actually happening. And that's because you've got very high institutional trust in the government, which you don't have in every country. You've got a lot of data sharing going on between the tech companies and the government and civil society groups, and that allows them to actually address these issues of misinformation and disinformation. In my view, regulation, it really can be sort of a double-edged sword, because if you have a government with its own sort of priorities, and China's probably the best example. Regulation often is just a cover for censorship. And if you look at what's going on in Xinjiang as well, the level of surveillance of the people there, I think it's regulation is often a dicey thing. And but then at the same time, if you look at the level of speech in a place like America, where it's not very policed, actually, the US is having a serious issue, in my view, in terms of its First Amendment rights, and the fact that it sort of sticks so closely to protecting the rights that come with the First Amendment, and you're seeing this particularly with things like hate speech on the extreme right, because I think the US is finding it difficult to police far-right hate speech because of their protections on speech. And so one might argue that with a place like China, you probably need a different kind of regulation, and with a place like the US, you might need a different way of actually dealing with these threats before they actually become violent, physical sort of threats that affect society.
Mm. So obviously, though, different countries have different ways of dealing with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, partly because of history and partly because of cultural different issues.
Yeah.
But how do you see, in your view, is there a difference between the concept of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, or are they two sides of the same coin, or exactly the same thing?
I think they're fairly similar. They're fairly similar. I mean, they can get expressed in different ways in different places, but they're fairly similar.
Yeah.
My sense of the overall concept of freedom of speech is that if democracies should prioritize the free exchange of ideas, as opposed to just freedom of speech. And when you prioritize the free exchange of ideas, what you also try to ensure is the freedom to hear from different people and different perspectives and different communities. Because if we live in a society
presumably even if you don't agree with what those people are saying, right?
Especially if you don't agree. Especially if you don't agree. Reverting back to one of the ways to sort of counter misinformation and disinformation, is media literacy and critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people say is actually quite useful is teaching people how algorithms work. Right? If each of us actually understands how these algorithms, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or whatever that's feeding you this constant stream of information work, then you might actually have a better sense for yourself on how to deal with misinformation and disinformation. So yes, back to the point, especially if you don't agree with particular groups or communities, it's good to have access to hear them. And I think in most societies, the issue with freedom of speech today is that there are differences in power, in money, in access. The most famous example being Elon Musk buying Twitter, now called X. And if we just prioritize freedom of speech, what might happen, which is already happening, is that you get the people with the biggest loudhailer, with the most money, with the most access, being able to drown out everybody else, right? But societies that actually try to prioritize the freedom of exchange of ideas, I think will then take a different view of how they regulate and think about giving access to different groups and communities. And this is not something that's going to happen overnight because of how the internet has been shaped over the past 20 years. But it's going to take some time, and I think as a philosophy, as a value, that's something that we need to aspire to, ensuring that we have the free exchange of ideas as opposed to just freedom of speech.
And that covers the whole gamut of things, ranging from universities deplatforming people whose views they find objectionable, but surely part of the role of education, particularly at the tertiary level, is to encourage students to think about lots of different ideas in order to be able to assess what they feel is most appropriate.
I do think in the classroom it's important for every voice and view to be heard, for sure. Now I think with universities it gets a bit dicey because we live in an environment today where something that's said can get amplified across the world in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
And something that a particular speaker says in, for example, the university where I went, Berkeley, so some, far right speaker goes to Berkeley and, for example, maybe says something harmful or hurtful against the LGBTQ community or against the Jewish community or against the transgender community. That in that specific context can often get dealt with and debated in a particular way. But if that gets transmitted through video all over the world, then the repercussions and impacts of that are very different, which is why in today's media environment, it's probably not enough to just say, the university is a sacred space and it's a space of contestation of ideas and anything should go in the university, because it's often not a closed space. It often gets amplified in many different ways all over social media across the world. And we do know for a fact that these potentially hurtful, harmful opinions can have a direct impact on the ground. And the best example is with the recent riots in the UK.
Yes.
Where the Elon Musks of the world were actually, in the name of free speech, and you can call them sort of free speech absolutists, in the name of free speech, promoting all sorts of dialogue, which actually had a direct impact on the ground in the UK.
Yeah, it's interesting, but that's not necessarily a new phenomenon. I mean, we were talking before our discussion began about the role of pamphleteering in the 18th century. So the French Revolution, was a lot of the ideas were fueled by inflammatory pamphlets that were being produced on very cheap printing presses in Paris, and that directly resulted in inflaming popular opinion, which resulted in tragic consequences for lots of people. Obviously, it's not on the press of a button, but it's at the turn of a printer's handle, and you get the same view being disseminated. So what you're talking about is something that is just the latest technological evolution of something that's been happening for a long time, right?
It is, in a way, the latest evolution of falsehoods, misinformation, and disinformation that have been propagated through different technologies throughout time. At the same time, I think there is something fundamentally different for a couple of reasons. If you think about the production of falsehoods, there's an adage now that social media has made distribution costs zero, and generative IA has made generation costs zero. So the generation and the distribution of falsehoods today essentially is something that anybody, anywhere, at their fingertips has tremendous technology to do. So that changes the nature of it on the production side. On the consumption side as well, I think what we're seeing today is that for the first time ever, people are almost uncritically accepting what they see coming through social media, coming through WhatsApp, regardless of the source. Sometimes the source is masked in different ways, presents the illusion of being a reputable news brand, but actually it's a propaganda machine. But people are uncritically accepting this as news, as fact, and that's their only sort of avenue of often getting updates on what's happening in the world. And I think that as well, the lack of criticality is different because of the speed and engagement as well than it has been in the past. So I think there are some differences with what we've seen before in today's world, fueled by technology.
Yeah. So as a media business owner and entrepreneur yourself, how do you navigate that minefield of both technology and noise to come up with something that is both impactful and commercially viable from a business perspective?
It's interesting because I see a real opportunity at this. I recall the sort of what happened during World War II. Amidst lots of propaganda, especially from Hitler, that was the time that the BBC actually, established itself as a sort of trusted brand, cultivated an audience and built its name in many ways. And I think right now we're living through a long period of adaptation to these new technologies and these new forms of misinformation and disinformation. I think this period of adaptation will probably take a couple of decades. But I think it again provides an opportunity for media brands who are able to establish trust with their core audience to actually build a name for themselves. Because increasingly where you get your information from is going to be as important, if not more important, than what the information is. So I think increasingly provenance, trust, authenticity, all these things will be very important when people look at their phones and figure out who they actually want to read or watch or listen to. And so I think for us the difficulty, the difficulty has to do with the business model. We are some call it reader funded, some in the old days we'd call it subscription. So we depend on our core audience as opposed to depending on advertising or depending on a big benefactor as a lot of big media companies do. And there's good and bad with depending on readers. I think the good thing is that you don't actually get swayed by commercial or government interests, right? Because we're just dependent on small donors at the end of the day. The difficulty in this period of time, very long answer to your question, but the difficulty in this period of time is that we're competing with these forces of speed and engagement. And we're trying to almost tell people, but I think we're sort of a little bit ahead of the curve, certainly in Asia. But we're trying to tell people that, you have to forget all the clickbait, forget all the sensationalist stuff that you're seeing, forget all the stuff that gets the most shares. It's important to sort of reshift your media diet towards sort of more well-researched, well-produced, more analytical content than you're actually seeing out there right now. So and we're competing with everything. We're competing with cat videos. We're competing with Netflix. We're competing with video games. Yeah. The media environment today is so diverse. Some might say we're sort of hopeless romantics who are still trying to believe in the value of long form journalism and a lot of these traditional ethics when it comes to commentary and analysis. But I do hope that we are just living through a transitory period, to get back to an earlier point. But that's the main challenge. I think we're just in the middle of this pretty crazy environment, which is information overload is often the main issue for a lot of people today. And if I look back at the main reason people have dropped their subscription to Jom in the past 6 months, when I talk to them, it's because they have too many subscriptions. They can't keep up with all their Substacks and so we just have to find a way to ride it out. It's not easy. I mean, we're only about halfway to breaking even on our operating costs, so it's not easy.
When you're talking about writing journalism under Jom, how do you put your team together? Because obviously you don't want to have a homogeneous view. You want different opinions coming through. You need somebody who's going to be the stone in your shoe and is coming up with that irritating counterpoint for your accepted opinion. Who's that, and what do they do for you?
That's a great point, and it's something I struggle with a lot. And it's not just the ideological bias within our team, where we're all sort of slightly left of center. So that's one issue, but it's also
slightly left of center. You went to Berkeley, right?
I might be more the extreme. The average is slightly. But it's also an ideological issue if you think about our reader-funded model. And I think this is something that the New York Times has had to grapple with as well in a very different context. But if you're reader-funded and if all your readers, want articles that are hammering Trump every week, there's a natural incentive to keep pushing out those articles, as opposed to broadening your perspective and thinking about things in different ways. So I think that's one of my biggest struggles. We're at Jom, as a team, we're extremely diverse on a whole bunch of identity markers, ethnicity and gender and all the rest of it. But ideological bias is something that does concern me for sure, and I have to often check on our blind spots. So what are the big issues? For example, in Singapore today, there will be issues like the death penalty, right? There will be issues like LGBTQ rights. There'll be issues, political liberalization, drugs, right? What is our view on these issues? How are we thinking about it? How are we talking about it? And do we have too much of an ideological bias because, all sort of similar in our thinking? And I don't think there's any sort of easy answer to this. I think a lot of media companies will be facing this challenge. And I think to some level, the industry dynamics that I described earlier also make it tricky because the small players are catering to niche audiences, and it's often the niche audiences that also force you into that corner and keep you into that corner in terms of your ideological bias. So how do you make sure that you're not too partisan in one way or the other? I think is an interesting question and challenge. I don't think there's an easy answer.
No, I agree with you. I mean, in our business, one of the jobs that we have to do with our clients is to talk about blind spots that they might have in terms of investment planning, whatever it is for the future. And the work that we do with them to uncover those blind spots is usually the single most valuable piece of work that we can do, which makes sense. Great, so we've had a fantastic conversation up until this point. Now we're going to turn the tables a bit. So Sudhir is going to ask me some questions. So the man in the Save the Friendly Unicorn t-shirt is going to STF you, and I'm going to do the talking. But anyway, what questions have you got for me?
Thanks, Steve. So I think we talked about the importance of trust in my industry, in media, and I was kind of curious about trust in your business and your industry, and in particular how sort of you as a more boutique firm think about trust with your clients vis-a-vis the real big boys and what their offering is to their clients.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the origin story of Javelin Wealth Management dates back to 2003 when I set this company up, specifically because as a user of services from financial advisors and banks, I was very unhappy with the quality of advice and service that I got. I didn't feel I was getting a good service, and I didn't feel I was getting value for money. And I felt that there had to be a better way of doing it. So I grew up in the early part of my career in London, operating under the strictures of the London Stock Exchange, whose motto in Latin is dictum meum pactum. My word is my bond. I say what I do, and I do what I say. And I felt that that was a message that should still resonate. And I dealt with really, really good companies over many, many years who do exactly that, but unfortunately they're a vanishingly small number, particularly for large financial organizations, which for a variety of different reasons, because they need to make money, and as they get bigger, scale becomes an issue, margins become an issue, and increasingly it means that they move more focused on process rather than the customer. And the customer, as a result, gets shortchanged and ends up getting a less good quality service. So, we all know that if you phone up a bank these days, you have to work through 5 different phone menus before you actually get to what you want, and that may be another 10 keystrokes before you actually speak to a live human being. I don't like that. So as a result, we have a business here which involves human beings dealing with human beings, our clients, and that's the way it should be. So we work really hard to deliver on exactly that, a human personal service for human personal people.
Actually, it's interesting because you just made me think of a particular parallel to our industry, because it's no longer just the actual media product, the article or the video or the podcast that is our form of relationship with our end user, our reader, but it's also the sense of community, right? They subscribe to Jom and they want to be part of Jom because of that relationship and of that idea that they are part of something bigger. So there's a very real human relationship that's also important now, which wasn't the case, obviously, if you think about the old days of traditional legacy media, where there was almost sort of this like ivory tower type approach to journalism, right? Distance was almost necessary between the writers and the readers, and
Yeah, I mean, I think that using your experience with The Economist, for example, so The Economist is a magazine which is legendary for not having individual journalist bylines underneath an article, right? What we do here is we look after our clients as a team. So they're not my clients, they are Javelin Wealth Management's clients, and they're looked after by Javelin Wealth Management as a team. So if I can add value to a conversation, I will be involved in that conversation. But very often, our clients come to us with a specific question, which it's much better if another member of my team answers. And so as a result, our clients get the full team rather than just Steve or somebody individually within the firm. And that's really important. And I think that people, I hope, when they engage with our business, will recognise the fact that they're getting, 10 people's time, 10 people's focus on the things that are important to them as a client, rather than just one.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think The Economist would not be able to start up in today's media environment with that policy of no bylines, because it's become so important in today's media world to know exactly who's talking to you. That there's been the rise of the personality and the positionality of the person, and that being important to the narrative.
It is, but that therefore means that The Economist is now the byline. Right?
Yeah.
So The Economist has a collective value to which all the contributors, all the journalists sign up, right? And that's what we've tried to do on a much smaller scale here, and I'm sure you're doing in Jome as well, is to sort of say, this is who we are, this is the product value that we deliver, this is our message, and this is what our clients get from us. And that's a core part of our DNA, and I think really in a world where so much is being disintermediated, and earlier in our conversation you said so much is being commoditized. Well, I'm not interested in commoditization, I'm interested in personalization, and that's the way it's got to be. You're not going to be able to run a huge business on that basis, because it is very focused on an individual, but you can still run a great business on that premise, and that's what we're seeking to do.
Yeah, that's great. And one more question gets back to something I talked a lot about and think about, which is misinformation and disinformation. I often think about it in the political realm, election interference. I think about it in the social realm, how it affects riots. I probably don't think about it much at all in terms of the financial realm, financial news, financial information, how the internet has changed the nature of information and falsehoods, if at all, and what impact that might have on the financial world. I don't know if you could speak a bit about that.
Well, there's just as much disinformation in the financial world, if not more, because money is made and lost on the basis of that information. Again, that's one of the reasons why regulation exists, is to prevent the dissemination of market-moving disinformation. But it's very difficult to do, which is kind of where a firm like mine comes in, which is when things are getting volatile, when people are jittery, you need somebody to step back and sort of say, okay, hang on a second, what's really changed here? So that's what we always do when prices are going up and down very, very sharply on the basis of certain interpretation of information. You kind of always have to sit back and say, okay, well, what's different today? People were happy to pay 10% more for this yesterday. Now it's 10% cheaper. Why aren't you buying more? What's changed? Sometimes, rarely, things do change and then you have to react accordingly. But more often than not, the best solution to do in those sorts of situations is to take a deep breath and say, well, not much has changed. And if I was happy with my strategy yesterday, I should be happy with it today. So take a breath, sit back, and stick with it. And that's invariably what we end up doing. In 2008-9 was a very good example of that. We made a very deliberate decision for the majority of that period to just basically sort of say, look, it is painful, it is volatile, but ultimately the strategy makes sense, and that's what we're sticking with, and ultimately that's what worked.
And in terms of the sources of authority, sources of information, has that also been democratized in a big way over the past 20 years, that it's no longer your sort of blue chip Financial Times type newspapers that people look to as sources of authority, but they're also, I'm guessing, a whole bunch of Substackers or people who run their own financial economics blogs type, who are increasingly important in the
Yeah, so
world?
I mean, it's certainly the case that the costs of investment have plummeted, which is a good thing. So the cost of dealing, the rise of Robinhood, the rise of chat groups on Reddit and so forth, which is underpinning what happened in GameStop with Roaring Kitty being the very famous example of somebody who was promoting a particular idea. Generally speaking, I think that's a good thing, because it makes investing cheaper. It makes it easier for people to access and for people to therefore use proper investment as part of planning for their financial future. That's good. What is not good is when that gets manipulated, and really that's where history expertise and experience really comes in, is to be able to try and sort out the wheat from the chaff as far as that's concerned, i.e. what is real here and what is not. What is our experience telling us about this particular situation? Is it something that has validity? Is it something to which we should react, or should we just sort of say, this company is still a great business. It's 10% cheaper today. Fantastic. Have some more.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that really, really makes sense. And in fact, people like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger built Berkshire Hathaway into this massive business, which were very much focused on those principles, which were created 100 years ago under Benjamin Graham and various others who have promoted this philosophy of sensible investment. And actually, Berkshire Hathaway's success to this day still points towards that being valid. Yeah, there are lots of people who can invest in crypto and so forth, which is a very different marketplace, and some people make a lot of money and others don't. But ultimately, what you're looking to try and do, and what we're trying to do, is to separate what's real and unreal, and what makes sense from the perspective of the people that we work for. So in my case, it's clients who are investing their money with us, and in your case, it's people who are reading your journalism and using that to support or challenge their view, and that's got to be a good thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. I often feel that I have to tell our readers that we don't have to cover every sensationalist or piece of news or content, precisely because it's the longer term sustainable stuff that we're doing and telling you about that's actually more important ultimately.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much for coming along for a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too.
Thanks a lot,
and
Steve.
I want one of those t-shirts.
I'll get you one. I've never done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.